Welcome to How to Talk to Weirdos. Employee surveys show that the most common complaint in corporations is communication. Communicating within your own team is challenging enough. But what happens when an introverted scientist and a gregarious salesperson need to work on an important project together? Self-described weirdo, Jeremy Doran is here to help. As host of the How to Talk to Weirdos podcast, Jeremy shares everything he's learned about communication as an engineer, speaker, coach, and student of psychology. He shares his findings, tips, and techniques, plus his conversations with experts to help all of us, especially us weirdos, talk to each other effectively. And now, here's Jeremy Doran.
Welcome to How to Talk to Weirdos. In my head, just so you know, I always like to add like me. I think it should be How to Talk to Weirdos like me, but in order to keep it short, I just made it How to Talk to Weirdos. This podcast is all about communicating with people who are different than you are. So when I was growing up, I often didn't understand what people meant, and frankly, they often didn't understand me. I always felt like I was a weirdo, so I've worked very hard to get better at communication, hopefully with at least some success. And as I studied and learned more about it, what I found out is that, in fact, everyone's a weirdo. Everyone thinks, processes, and communicates so differently that it causes a lot of miscommunication. And it can make other people seem, well, weird. So this podcast is about paying attention to the differences and figuring out how to get better at talking with people who may seem very different than you. So today's guest is Dr. Jennifer Berton, or Dr. Jen. She's the founder of the Rose Center for Learning, which gives supervision and trainings to mental health clinicians and community workshops on a variety of mental health topics. Dr. Jen is a licensed clinical social worker with a master's and PhD from UC Berkeley. Over the last 28 years, she's worked in every point of the mental health system and now splits her time between a private counseling practice and teaching clinicians through her website and at UConn. But actually, her job is to feed and transport the star clinician in her company, Rosie the dog. Dr. Jen, welcome. It's great to have you here today.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So when I first described this podcast that I want to do to you, you almost jumped out of your seat and instantly said, I want to be on it.
That's true.
Tell me what was so interesting about the topic and why you wanted to be on this podcast.
Well, anytime to talk about why you are a weirdo and why I might think you're a weirdo is going to be, I'm going to sign up immediately, knowing you as I do. But also more to the point of your general audience that I haven't met, I think communication it's the foundation of everything that we do, and it is fraught with all sorts of missteps and confusion and success. And so it's something I love talking about with every client I work with, and then also just in the general public. I was at a dinner party last night and we were talking about miscommunicating and all of the consequences thereof. So it's a hot topic always.
Yeah, always is. So in your private counseling practice, I imagine you have some pretty charged conversations with people. So
Yes.
A lot of communication skills must come into play. So did you receive training on how to have those kind of communications? And when you're teaching other clinicians, are there things that you teach them?
Yeah. So, it's interesting about communicating. You're really trying to take your internal process and share that with somebody else, and then also understand and interpret somebody else's internal process through words, through nonverbal language. There's a lot of different ways we communicate things. So when you're in school to be a counselor, it's one of the things that they talk about so much is how to really understand the person who's in front of you, not only by what they're saying verbally, by the context of what they're saying, by all of the other nonverbal things, gestures that they give you. And that really helps not only with clients, but in just general daily life. So much of it is lost because we're not really taught how to do it well necessarily from the beginning. And certain people just excel at it naturally and certain people don't. And there's a big wide gap in there. So we learn how to understand someone's mental process by understanding what they are giving to us and trying to work with that. So it's a lot of the sleuthing that we do is looking for the communication styles and what they're trying to say.
A mental sleuth. I like it.
Yeah.
So I've seen a lot of studies on what % of communication are the words, the tone of voice, and body language.
Yep.
Do you have any of those statistics that you
Yeah.
believe, share?
I hate statistics. I hate them,
Great.
especially when we're talking about this kind of thing, because statistics are just a way to crunch numbers depending on who is looking at the numbers. And so I learned actually in statistics in my PhD, I learned to not trust statistics. That was basically the whole premise of the class. So what I would say is, out of all the people that I've worked with, I think communication is. I think I would say 100%. People struggle 100%. Not 100% of the time, but in your lifetime, you're going to struggle. There's such a vast amount of, I mean, there are many parts to communication, is what I will say. And so it is perfectly normal for people to excel in some of those and struggle in others with different people, different contexts, different ages. So I think it's everybody. That's what I would say. So going with what you say, you definitely are a weirdo, but so is everybody else.
Excellent. That is reassuring to hear. What are some
Yeah.
what are some of the things that cause miscommunication? Are there certain aspects
Yeah.
that cause trouble?
Well, the first thing is, communication can be really uh, broken down to there's like the semantics, right? So grammar, what word choice, vocabulary, things like that. But there's also rules for conversation, there's rules for storytelling, and then there's context. So those rules can change if you're talking to a family member at a campfire versus a job interview with a potential boss. Those are going to have different rules of how you engage. And then there's really understanding the styles of communication that people bring, and you mentioned this, so like really understanding a style that's different from yours that somebody is bringing to the conversation. So recognizing, understanding, but then also being able to pivot your style if it's not successful. So a lot of what we look at in communication is you have your own way of communicating, but are you able to pivot and change that style if it's not being successful, which means you have to read the reactions of other people to your style and be able to negotiate that as you go through. That's a lot in just a tiny little piece of communication. Every sentence that you say to someone has all of those parameters. And so people, you can struggle in any way there, right? And so part of it is really learning how to knowing your own style and being aware of your own style, and then really having exposure to lots of other styles and practice in pivoting as necessary.
Can you give me an example of a communication style?
Yeah, so somebody who uses humor, and maybe they have a dry, wry sense of humor. They use a lot of sarcasm or a lot of inference in their
I don't
speeches,
know
in their
anyone like
speech.
that.
I'm just, looking at who I'm looking at right now. But yeah, so, somebody, you might use your style and somebody got you right away and they'll laugh like I just did. I just laughed when you said a sarcastic comment about yourself. But somebody else would say, what do you mean? I don't understand. Or they'll take you more literally. And so the sarcasm falls short. Or they'll think you're, abrasive, or you're, not fun to talk to because they don't understand that context. Yeah. So
That
those are
has happened to me in the past, I must admit. So you hit that nail right on the head. Uh,
yeah.
so earlier you talked about pivoting when
Mm.
your style isn't working with someone else. What are some things that you look for that indicate your communication isn't working?
Yeah. So people normally, not everybody, I will exclude you from this, but normally people have a wide range of facial expressions where you can really read those. It's one of our biggest communicators is our body posture, what we're doing with all of the parts of our body, but also particularly the face. So if I'm saying something and I'm making a joke, let's say, and it doesn't land, I usually can detect that because your facial expression will show that. You're not smiling, you're not laughing. Sometimes it's the absence of gestures, and sometimes it is some expression that shows me, oh, that was offensive. You didn't like that, because my eyes show my furrowed brow, my mouth goes down. So I work a lot with preschoolers, and that's one of the things we do is we trace I literally have them take their fingers and trace what their mouth is doing and what their eyes are doing and look across at somebody else so that you can start to understand those gestures. What really can stump someone is someone like maybe, I don't know, you, who has like, one or two expressions always, and then that's harder to read. So then you have to pivot into something else. How else can you read, how engage, how someone is reacting to your whatever you're putting forth in the conversation? It can be tricky.
I like to call it my resting neutral face, and
Yes.
it gives people issues with reading me sometimes. When I was
Yeah.
growing up, I'm the youngest of 10 kids. And what I found was that sharing my emotion was something that could often be used against me.
Mm.
And so I learned at a young age to share as little as possible. And that
Hmm.
is something that I'm still to this day trying to unlearn. And
Yeah.
I've dated people before, and someone told me that I need to have a sign. When I say something that's important, hold up a sign saying it's important, because my face and my tone of voice don't indicate it every time.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? I'll give you another classic example of that. When I was working many, many years ago, like 20 years ago at this point, 25, I was working with a young person, and my father came to visit. And my father's way of communicating is respect and honor are very important to him. And he was in the military. So he doesn't always look at you in the eye as a sign of respect. You know, he might look down and let you, communicate, and then he'll look up and engage. And this young person came after my father visited. He came in and he said, "What is wrong with your father? He's a jerk, isn't he?" And I was like, "What are you talking about? He's like the sweetest teddy bear of a man." And he said, "Well, he wouldn't look at me in the face. And he went on this whole litany of how my father must be judging him based on his appearance, his age, his whatever he was talking about, because he wouldn't look at him in the eye." And I thought, oh, this is such a good example of my father's intention was to be respectful, and the reception was that he was being disrespectful. It's a common thing. Or to put it with a clinician's terms, I make the clinicians that I work with often videotape themselves or look in the mirror and do a mock session. And I had a clinician that kept on doing this face when a client was talking. And I paused the video and I said, "What is that face?" And he said, "Oh, that's my I'm interested face." And I said, "Oh, because that looks like I'm suspicious, I don't believe what you're saying face." And that's going to make a client shut down. So it's really interesting use of time to look at what nonverbal gestures and facial expressions you put out there. It might be not what you think.
Nice. Thank you. And that brings me back to Rosie the dog, who you said is your star
Yes,
clinician.
she is.
So I've raised a number of dogs and trained them, and eye contact with dogs is a pretty interesting thing. When it's your dog,
Yeah.
eye contact can really help bring you closer. But if it's a dog you don't know, eye
Yeah.
contact can definitely be a sign of aggression to them.
Yes.
So is that something that's similar to people?
Sure. And also, I mean, yes, just full stop. So certain people, might see something as warm and engaging, and other people might see it as too much. And dogs are the same way. Like you, exactly as you said, you communicate with your dog through your eyes, but a dog you've just met, you wouldn't do that. That would be potentially intimidating to that dog and can, get them on the offense or the defense, as it may be. So that's not what you want with people either. You really want to read how they are. And this is what dogs do really well, is they will read, I don't know, it's magic, I think, but I guess maybe it's the energy of the person that they are really tapping into, but they will read, just know when they can cuddle, when they need to step back, when they need to be playful. Rosie's different with every person that she meets, and it's something that she's reading. And I think they do that better than humans. All we have are the things I've talked about, but I think dogs have some sort of additional dog sense that allows them to read people quickly, efficiently, and then respond accordingly.
I definitely agree with that. I used to have a Doberman, and he was excellent. And if he ever didn't like a stranger, I was firmly on board with that stranger probably
Yes.
isn't a good person.
Yeah,
And
you
so,
trusted that.
but then, when my daughter was 1, my daughter would climb on his back, pull on his
Yeah.
ears, and he would just lay there kind of whimpering, and he wouldn't get up because he knew he would knock her over. He would wait
Yeah.
until she got off and then run into another room. So they have an amazing sense of people. It's great.
They're just amazing. I know. I learn so much from her every day.
So how do you use her as a clinician?
A lot of ways. So one is I read her energy. So that's one of the things that you do as well. And I really pay attention to what she can do. My classic example with Rosie is of the very first time that I had her in the office. I had only known her for 2 days. And I thought, oh, she seems great. I'll just bring her and see what happens, which is not advised. Don't do that at home. But My first client was a 14-year-old boy who was in the middle of an anxiety attack and had just gotten into a fight with his mom, so he was pretty escalated. And it would take me the majority of the session to talk him back down and de-escalate him to a place where we could do some work. But she saw him and immediately jumped into his lap, and he de-escalated in about a minute and a half. It was the most amazing thing I've ever seen. So there was some sort of energy exchange where she was really able to absorb that in him, or however it works, and he was able to de-escalate, and then we could get some really good work done to get him on a path of wellness. And then with young people who are really having a lot of impulse challenges, we play games with the dog. We incorporate her so that they learn to get the dog to sit and wait, and get her to do certain things while she's waiting, and then tell her to go. And then we use that while the child is able to learn the same thing for themselves. And Rosie writes letters to them and talks about all of the good work that they're doing and has this great relationship with them. So I'll use her in that way too. So sometimes it's just comfort, and sometimes it's active games where I'm trying to teach a principle through her.
How is her handwriting?
Actually, it's really bad. She needs to type with like one tiny little part of her paw. It's very difficult. It takes forever.
Scratch and peck, it's not good.
Scratch and peck. Yeah.
Back to eye contact and dogs and humans, I suppose. Is there a right ratio of how much eye contact to make versus too much, not enough? Tell me more about that.
Yeah, it's actually really funny that you say that, because we have, I don't know if you're aware, but there is some sort of place where your thoughts are. And it could be on the ceiling, and it could be, roving around. It could be on the floor. But everyone has, while you're thinking about what you're going to say, or while you're talking, we don't just lock eyes and interrogate someone and just never, ever change our point of view. We, use our surroundings to find our thoughts and bring them into our brains and out our mouths. And so because of that, you can really end up darting your eyes all over the place, being shifty-eyed, and that makes people uncomfortable, especially if you're doing what we are now, where you're on some sort of a online visual platform and you're not in person with whoever you're speaking with, so that you can't see what's on the other side of my screen. It could look like I'm talking to somebody or thinking about somebody over here or distracted of something over there. And that can affect your communication. So the key is to know, first of all, where your thoughts lie, because we usually have specific places. And you want to not be too darting, not be too interrogating with those fierce, stare of eyes. So you want to vary it, but you want to vary it slowly and really try to have the majority. There's not a time. That would be a good, how long do people feel uncomfortable if I stare at them? I don't know that that's been timed, because people will probably vary on that, of their comfortability. But that's basically what you want to do. It would be a fun experiment, line people up and be like, when are you uncomfortable? I'm just going to keep on staring. It would vary.
One thing I've found with my daughter when she was a teenager is I actually really enjoyed teaching her how to drive, which people look at me like I'm crazy, but
I'm doing that now. It's pretty fun, isn't it?
It was great time together, other than the white knuckles occasionally.
Yes.
But the conversations we had were great because she couldn't look at her phone, and we didn't need to make eye contact. Yeah. And I sit at a table with someone at a restaurant. I'll often try to sit on the same side or 90 degree, because then it makes it so that not making eye contact isn't awkward.
Yeah.
And I think that can make conversations go a lot easier sometimes.
You're so right. I do a lot of walk and talks with my clients for that reason. People feel safer and more comfortable talking if they're not being looked at, or if they don't have to look at someone. So we'll be walking parallel. Or I almost wrote a book. I still think I should. I don't know what happens when I get on planes if I'm by myself. Whoever I'm sitting next to just feels like it's a confessional, and they say the most amazing things during the flight. And I swear part of it is that they're not actually looking at me. And also earlier in my career, I drove a very large van. I would drive clients from home to their day treatment. And those were the best sessions I ever had, were in that van. So I think there's really something to that when you don't have the eyes on you, and you think, I feel safer to expose whatever thoughts I want to talk about. Yeah.
So a funny story about me. I used to travel for work a lot. I would fly all the time, and a whole bunch of us did. And someone was saying, don't you hate it when people talk to you on airplanes? And I said, no, people don't talk to me on airplanes.
Oh.
They're like, what do you mean? I'm like, no one's ever talked to me on an airplane before. They're like, that's amazing. What do you do? I'm like, I don't know that I do anything. I clearly just give a I don't want to be talked to vibe, and somehow they get it.
It's probably your one facial expression.
Yeah, I've got two, maybe three.
I know you do have two. You do have two. I don't mean to diminish that. But it's true. There must be something. I've always wondered that, because this is not, I don't say what I do to people, and I am like a magnet. I mean, people just, I don't even bring books, out on my lap anymore, because I never get to read them on flights. People just talk. And I'm chatty, but I'm really not being chatty. I really just sit down and say nothing until they start talking. Then I say things. Nice. But there must be something they're reading. It's like the dog with the energy. They must be reading our energy in some way.
Yep.
I try to have a don't talk to me energy, but it doesn't work.
No, I just don't think you have that in you.
I try. No.
So when you are dealing with your patients, how often is it that they're coming to you because of a communication issue, or is it that they come to you with something else and communication is a contributing factor?
Yeah, it's mostly the second thing. So I think often, sometimes people are aware of it, or they've been told that they have a communication issue. I'd say that's 10% of the time. The majority of the time, it's really people who are coming in with some area of their life that they feel like isn't working. Sometimes they don't even know what's not working. They just don't feel good. And so they're coming in and trying to figure out what they can do, or how I can help them. And it almost always has some communication component somewhere embedded in there. And certainly, like for couples work, those people who were clinicians who work with couples, the percentage would be, really high.
Yeah. Turns out communication's an issue almost everywhere you go. They do surveys at corporations in America, the number one complaint every time is communication. Yeah. And if you look at complaints across the board, within marriages, within friendships, within organizations, it's always communication.
Yeah. Well, you know why? I mean, the teams, whether it's a marriage or whether it's a corporate team or any other kind of team, they work best when there is a variety of styles. That's just how it goes. But when there is a variety of styles, that also means that there's a big propensity for clashes. And so if you don't understand the styles and know how to work around those, with them, use them, then it can really, crumble rather than be the biggest, support to that team.
Yeah, I often work with engineers who have been promoted into management roles. Yeah. And that is sometimes a difficult transition, because then all of a sudden they need to deal with the emotions of the people on their team, and not to generalize too much, but that doesn't tend to be a strength of engineers. And then they have to start dealing with sales and marketing people and upper management. And sometimes they struggle.
That's like that human connection, right? And people in my industry struggle with math. So there you go. Yeah.
So one of the things that a couple of things about engineers, again, generalizing horribly, so take it with a grain of salt. Okay. They tend to be more logical than emotional, and they tend to be more introverted than extroverted, and they tend to like details a little bit more than most other people do.
Yeah. So how do you teach the emotional component of conversation making to people whose brains are, analytical rather than that kind of emotional engagement? How do you do that?
Well, one thing, I take improv classes, and a core of improv is yes and. And yes and really just means you accept the other person, whatever they say or whatever it is, you accept that, and then you try to build from it. So one issue that I think people have who think very differently is it feels like the other person is trying to be difficult. Yeah. But really just their frame of reference is so different than yours. And if you can just accept their frame of reference as a real thing, then it makes it a lot easier to start working together.
Very well said.
Yeah. Thank you.
Then I have nothing to add.
Full stop. I don't think I've ever heard you say you have nothing to add. So this score a point for me right now.
Congratulations. No, that's true. I think that's a very interesting also point of study. You could go down a rabbit hole, but So I work on with little people, I mean young people, and I use things like comic strips and storybooks, and we look at the same principles you're talking about from improv. We're teaching people through the use of, sometimes some people, clinicians have computer-based programs, but that's what you're looking at social scenarios over and over and over again and trying to understand and detect and be able to pivot. And that's what improv does naturally. It's actually a brilliant, like, all people in the corporate sphere could probably benefit from experiencing improv in that way, right?
Yeah,
brings
there are
forth.
workshops that improv groups will go into corporations and
Yeah.
give for active listening and idea generation.
Yeah, I mean that's right. And understanding styles, but as you said, so working with styles rather than the carnal mistake people make is trying to change someone's style to match their own, or to force a style, or to, rather than to embrace the differences and work with them and build on them, which is what improv naturally does, right? As you said.
Yep. Yes,
So
and
I did have
it's a
something
good.
to add. Whatever.
Damn, I lost my point.
So close.
So going back to your patients,
Yeah.
I often, talking about myself, will jokingly say to clinicians I happen to know that I might be somewhere on the spectrum, and they always immediately say, no, you're not. And then they think about it for a second and they say, well, you might be kind of close. So,
Yeah.
but I use the term very loosely, as I'm
Yeah.
sure a lot of people do. Can you explain it a little bit more of what it actually is and
Sure.
what kinds of communication problems that might cause?
Yeah. So when someone says they're on the spectrum, they mean the autism spectrum. The autism spectrum is a very specific thing. In people's, jargon, we tend to say anyone can be on the spectrum, but it actually is a very robust diagnosis that you have to have certain things in order to qualify. And it is a spectrum, which means it's a range. So from mild to severe, and it has two components. One is this social communication deficiency, but there's another diagnosis called social communication disorder, or SCD, and that is half of what autism spectrum is, but you can have that on its own. If you only have issues with communication and you match the diagnosis on all the criteria, and it clearly impairs your life, and your ability to function in social settings, then there's a diagnosis called SCD, social communication disorder, and that is new. Autism spectrum has that component, plus you have to have restricted and repetitive behaviors. So that could be something like you'll see children flap their hands, or spin plates, or it could be that they're perseverating on a topic and they just talk about a topic over and over and over again, but it's that restricted and repetitive piece. Now, you can vary in those two things. One of those can be mild while the other is severe, and et cetera, but someone who's on the spectrum has to have both of those impairments. So we used to have something called Asperger's, which was a separate category, but it really also has those same two components. It's just technically on the mild end, so it was absorbed into autism spectrum. But that's basically what it is. Most people who say, like, oh, I think I'm on the spectrum because I have this problem with social communication, it's probably more likely that they would look at social communication and not autism. But that's how we say it in most people's, general conversation.
Great. Thank you for clearing that up. Now, if someone has that social communication issue, what are some things that they can generally do? What are steps they can take on their own?
So not someone on the autism spectrum, but just someone who's struggling with communication.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I would love to do a deep dive, because there's, the internet has lots of information, some great, some not. But in this case, it would be really beneficial to look at all the different communication styles. So much has been written about different communication styles, different nonverbal techniques. And I would practice. I would get people in your life that have different styles than you, who are willing to do this with you, and just practice different contexts and different social engagement, and really pay attention to what other people bring to the table, and practice that pivoting, practice being able to read people well. You could stop a conversation and say, okay, I read in your face This is what I read. Is that correct? And also another thing that goes into this is understanding emotions. And not everyone is good at that either. There's a whole thing called emotional literacy, and we're not really taught how to do that. So if I say, "Oh, you look angry," and you think, "Oh, I'm at peace," part of that is, do I really understand what anger looks like? Do I understand what anger feels like? Am I misattributing that? So that's a good, important part of communication too.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right.
Also listen to this
Before-
podcast. Sorry, of course.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
It's
Yeah.
yes. Good. Excellent.
Right? Yeah.
Now you're going to be invited back since you
Oh,
said
good.
that. I believe that you were talking about books. You have written a book, have you not?
Yes, but not on this topic. I wrote a book
okay.
on ethics, ethics particularly for addiction professionals, although it's really universally used now with all professionals. But yeah, that's one of my loves. I could talk about ethics all day long.
Oh,
Yeah.
great. Yeah, everyone could. So fun.
People think it's
Our-
boring. I don't get it. It's so vibrant.
Yeah. Well, statistically, people think that it's boring.
No, statistics are bad.
All right. We are getting ready to wrap this up, so I want to ask you a few questions. Ready?
Okay. Yeah.
What is a favorite place you've traveled to, and what is a place you've never been but really want to go to?
Okay, well, reverse order. I would say I really want to go to Bali. That's my next. I shouldn't say my next place because I don't know, but I would love to go to Bali. And then more recently, I went to Berlin to run a marathon, and it was really incredibly fun and vastly different. And I love going to places that are very different from where I live.
Nice.
Yeah.
And I imagine there were some communication issues from being in another country.
Yes, although they really speak English very well in
Yeah.
Germany. They do.
Yeah, I lived in Italy for a year, and I never
Mm.
got to learn Italian quite as well as I wanted to because
Yes.
everyone speaks English.
I
All
know,
right,
it's
question number
disappointing.
2.
Yes. Hmm.
Who do you think is an excellent communicator and why? And this could either be someone in your personal life or a public figure.
Okay, lots of examples, but the first person that comes to mind is a very good friend of my parents. He was sort of like a second father to me. His name is Peter Brook, and he has an unbelievable ability to be or to make someone feel like they are the most important person in the room. And when I was a young child, especially, there was a gaggle of children and I was pretty low. You know what that's like. I was pretty young in that. So I wasn't always taken seriously or as someone who had important things to say. And he would just make you feel like time had stopped and would just listen to whatever thing I was saying as a 7-year-old and treat it with the same respect as somebody his own age. And I've never forgotten that. He's consistently that way, and it makes someone feel so great.
That is a great quality. Yeah, again, studies show that people feeling seen and heard is so crucial and so rare, especially
Yes.
in corporations. And
Yes.
a great statistic in a corporation that, engineering managers don't always want to talk about people feeling seen and heard, but people who do are statistically more productive and the companies make more profit. So
Yes.
it makes more sense.
Absolutely.
All right, last question. What is
Yeah.
one piece of advice about communication that you would share with people?
Huh. It's funny because it's pretty much just what you just said. Thank you. Good night. No, which is that, if you look at communication as this two-way street, or however many people you're communicating with, where everyone is really coming into a collective with their own ideas. And part of what the communication, really, I think the most important part of communication is understanding the other person rather than getting your point across. If you go into any kind of interaction that way, you'll be more successful. If you're going in trying to say, I have to drive home my point of view, then you're not going to be listening well, and the interaction is not going to be as successful. So if you want to be able to obviously speak your mind as well, but it's important to be able to understand and welcome the other person's perspective, and that makes it so much more interesting.
Nice. I like that. All right, Dr. Jen, we're going to wrap it up. It has been an absolute pleasure talking with you today. Thanks for sharing your information and making it fun. If people want to find out more about you, and learn how you might be able to help them, where can they find more information?
I have a website called rosecenterforlearning.com or myrosecenter.com. Those are two sites. They can go and find me there easily.
Great. All right, everybody. Reach out to Dr. Jen, see what else she has to say, because there is quite a lot. Thank you for being on with me today, and have a wonderful one.
Thanks. Have a good one, Jeremy.
You too. Bye.
Thanks for listening to How to Talk to Weirdos. Check out our website at www.jeremydoranspeaks.com and follow Jeremy Doran Speaks on Instagram and follow our LinkedIn showcase page, How to Talk to Weirdos, for more great content and to suggest episode ideas. Please follow us on your favorite podcast player to get our latest episodes. And remember, everyone is a weirdo to someone.